I definitely hope that we get to a point where I don't have to do this work anymore, and that we can all learn to just be respectful and treat each other all with respect and love, because it's really tough for anybody, to go through these things. But I think what's happening is, we've seen in the media, we've seen in the data where Indigenous people have gone missing in that regard. There, those cases are not being, blown up to the national level. You're not hearing about it. We've known, for many years that this has been an issue, and it just hasn't been talked about. It hasn't been talked about in the media. And it really wasn't until we had some data and numbers to show, like, hey, Indigenous people actually are going missing and being murdered at a higher rate. And so had to really start collecting that data. And if you saw from the Urban Indian Health Institute, they put out a report, which I think really helped jumpstart. And folks out of Canada were doing some reports as well. And it's really helped put this issue on the map of saying, like, needs to be addressed and needs to be addressed now.
That's Kendra Closter, the co-director of law and policy at the Alaska Native Women's Resource Center. This is the Silver Linings Handbook podcast. I'm Jason Blair. Kendra Closter is the co-director of law and policy at the Alaska Native Women's Resource Center, an organization dedicated to strengthening local, state, and tribal government responses to the needs of Native women and children in their communities and their homes. Those challenges range from addressing domestic violence and sexual abuse, trafficking, and also helping with the healing from trauma and related injustices. Kendra, who's a member of the Tlingit tribe, also has Irish and German ancestry. The Tlingit are one of 231 federally recognized tribes in Alaska. The Tlingit people, whose name means people of the tides, are Indigenous people who have a vast history that some believe began more than 11,000 years ago. There are an estimated 14,000 Tlingit in Alaska and 2,100 in Canada. Their culture and society developed in the temperate rainforest parts of the Yukon, British Columbia, southeast Alaskan coast, and the Alexander Archipelago, the part of Alaska that runs south along the coast toward British Columbia. Kendra grew up in Juneau and Wrangell, a small fishing town made of shores and deltas, with beautiful views of bays and mountains along the Alaskan coast. It's a place where totem poles on the property of a replica of a traditional longhouse once occupied by Tlingit royalty can be seen in the views of American flags. And it's a place where American, Native, Russian, and British cultures have all left their mark. At the Alaska Native Women's Resource Center, Kendra works with partner organizations to develop relationships with community government and tribal organizations and push for policies and laws that help support Natives in Alaska. Among those initiatives include legislation that helped create permanent positions within the Alaska Department of Public Safety that focused on missing and murdered Indigenous women. Alaska now has its own Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women's Unit within the Department of Public Safety. In addition, Kendra was a part of the team that worked on Senate Bill 151, a bipartisan law that passed with 31 sponsors in the Alaskan legislature and made the third requirement of all police officers working in Alaska to be cultural training related to Indigenous people. Kendra is also a member of the State Missing and Murdered Indigenous People Council and a working group in Alaska on missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. Kendra says that her ambition is to make positive changes, and her hopes include everyone being accepted for who they are, that experiences rooted in family and tradition are valued, and that everyone in Native communities in Alaska has a sense of safety. Prior to working for the Alaskan Native Women's Resource Center, Kendra worked in the office of United States Senator Ted Stevens, a Republican from Alaska, and then moved from DC back to Juneau to work at the Alaska State Legislature, where she was employed for a decade. She served as the executive director of Native Peoples Action, a nonpartisan organization focused on strengthening Alaska Native people and their ways of life, which included everything from the right to hunt, fish, harvest, gather, and trap, to ceremonies and stewardship of their land. She's a graduate of Fort Lewis College in Colorado, where she obtained a bachelor's degree in business administration, and the University of Alaska Anchorage, where she obtained a master's degree in public administration and policy analysis. Today, we're going to talk about Native communities and some of the beauties and challenges they face, efforts to strengthen the relationship between Natives and others, the power of law, policy, and partnerships, and some of the unique difficulties and beauties for Native Alaskans, and some of those triumphs, some of which might be able to be emulated everywhere where Indigenous cultures are trying to protect their ways of life, be healthy, and be safe. So, Kendra, I just wanted to thank you for joining me today. I'm so glad I was able to make this sort of surprising, connection to you, because I had really originally been looking at some of the work that had been done in Alaska around Indigenous people and some of the data you guys had collected around justice. And by happenstance, we were introduced, and I was able to see, not just the justice aspect, but some of the public policy things that you're doing that are really exciting, that I know, at least I think, based on my survey of the landscape, some of which are sort of ahead of what we're seeing in other states. So I was really excited to be able to have this conversation with you.
Yeah, I'm glad we had a chance to connect, and I look forward to, talking more and sharing about, the work that we've been doing here in Alaska. I think it's been exciting. We've got a ways to go, but we've made some really good headway, in our policies and education and awareness.
Yeah. But, one of the things I wanted to sort of start with, though, is just a little bit about you, kind of your experiences and your background. One of the things that when I was sort of looking at your, resume in my head, I thought there are a lot of things that you could have done. You could have gone to Washington and, worked your way up in government there, or you could have gone into politics. You could have done a wide variety of things. What ultimately brought you back or to Alaska and the kind of work that you're doing now?
Yeah, I think I know a lot of me growing up in Alaska and with the family support and background and my really deep connection with my grandmother, to be honest, really put into a lot of things that have led me to where I am. I left Alaska for a little while to go to school, and I worked for Ted Stevens in Washington, D.C., and got a really good experience, but I wanted to bring that home to Alaska to see where I could contribute. And where I really kind of fell into place, is policy really called to me, but also how can I use my policy experience and my love of policy to help Alaska Native people. And so that's kind of how I fell into like where I'm at now at the Women's Resource Center, and some of my previous other nonprofits as well, is just how can I benefit the community? How can I provide benefits and support to our Alaska Native people who are just so amazing and beautiful and such rich cultures all throughout Alaska? But there's definitely some really tough things Indigenous people, in Alaska and across, the world have had to face when it comes to, colonization and boarding schools and, the high rates of domestic violence, sexual assault, and missing and murder Indigenous people. And so I think that's really what called to me is how can I just make a difference in this way? And I've been really blessed in meeting some beautiful people and sisters along the way where we just grew in partnership. And by having that support, by having the support of my family and the roots that I grew up with within the Tlingit culture and our ways of life have just really brought me home to Alaska. And this is where I want to be, and this is the area I just chose to work in. And so I guess that's kind of how I got here. But I also, like I say, I'm kind of a self-proclaimed policy nerd. And so we all use our strengths, right? There's so many strengths of people, whether you're an artist, really into data and education and advocacy. There's a place for all of us and how we can come together and help move a lot of
Yeah.
these issues forward.
It's interesting you say that because I think a lot of people, I was thinking your example of artists, a lot of people don't realize that they can lend their varied skills to a cause. But one of the things that you said, you mentioned family, roots, you mentioned your grandmother. Um, it sounds like all of those things are very important to you. Did you grow up with your grandmother in Alaska? Did you grow up in what was growing up like?
Yeah, I was born and raised in Southeast Alaska. I was born in Wrangell, a little small fishing town in Southeast, and grew up in Juneau, really going between the two. Our highway system in Southeast is a ferry system, the marine highway system. So that's really how we got around between our communities there. And my grandmother used to come when I moved to Juneau. She used to actually take the ferry, come and pick me up, and bring me home to Wrangell. And so I
Mhm.
spent a lot of time doing back and forth, and she got me involved in dance groups, in beading, and just lots of different things that I've been really appreciative of. And so, yeah, she actually just passed away about a year ago. So she's been
Mm.
in my life, really instilling a lot of values in me. And so that's where I get kind of my energy and my fuel from her, from our people, and from my kids. They've also, I've got three kids who I look at the work that I do to say, how can I, put my heart and soul into this work to ensure that whatever we pass to our future generations is going to be better. Because I certainly
Mhm.
hope some of the issues that we're working on now are not passed down. And so that's, something I really want to see. I want them to feel safe and, be able to live in a culture where I don't have to worry about them going missing or being murdered or having domestic violence. And so, how do we build in those layers of respect and public safety and addressing some of the, intergenerational trauma that's been happening within communities? But I feel very fortunate to grow up in Alaska because there's just so many, as I mentioned earlier, so many beautiful cultures, so many beautiful people. I fish a lot. I love fishing. I love being out berry picking.
Mm.
That's our way of life is harvesting. I just filled my freezer full of sockeye salmon and blueberries, and that's what we do all summer is just being out on the land and prepping for our winter, but it's a great place to grow up.
Yeah. The one of the things I was thinking about when you were talking, you had mentioned things like boarding schools, and I think a lot of people probably don't understand that for natives, boarding schools weren't just being sent off to school as a separation of the families, languages were lost. There was an attempt to sort of like assimilate. And I was just thinking as you were talking about all those things, the berry picking, beading, fishing, that those are all sort of like core pieces of sort of, you mentioned your way of life. And sometimes when I think of those things, I think of like what a miracle it is. Like if you look from the point of colonization to now, what a miracle it is that those ways of life have been passed down and are in your hands right now when you know, I think it must have taken an enormous amount of resilience for the generations that came before you and an enormous amount of strength for them to be able to keep those going, pass them on to you. Do you feel a sense of responsibility to carry that forward, it sounds like?
Yes, I would say maybe responsibility, but also that might not quite be the word too, where
Mm,
it's who I am.
yeah.
It's who we are as people. And so it's it's sharing our culture, it's sharing our way of life. And it's just I couldn't think of another way that I would bring up my family. And something really beautiful, I think, in the way that, we do raise our kids. And we were out so last couple years ago, we were out fishing for hooligan. They're like the small kind of smelt. And I looked over and my daughter, as she was taking them out and putting them in the bucket, she was going, "Thank you. Goodness cheesh. Thank you," to every single little fish. And that's
Mm,
not something I told her to do. It's ingrained in us to just really be thankful for what we're getting and for the life of the fish and animals that are coming into us. This is just part of like who we are. So it's just this, I don't know, I don't quite have the word for it, I think, but again, it's our culture, it's our way of life, it's who we are. So it's
you
being
couldn't
passed down.
imagine living any other way. It's yeah, yeah. That's really beautiful, that moment with your daughter, thanking every little fish for the gift that it's giving to your family. And you know, I know when you first came to Alaska, that way work related to sort of the way of life for the different Native communities is something that you focused on, and I think you sort of just probably summed up the importance of it. But I was going to ask you what you think. You had mentioned those challenges and hoping that future generations have fewer of them. What do you view the challenges of the past that still reverberate and the challenges of today as?
We see the effects of colonization that has happened. And I mentioned boarding schools where really, as you mentioned, that people were taken out of their kids were taken out of their homes. They were forced to be in the schools where they had to really assimilate, getting their hair cut, not being able to speak their language and live their way of life. So a lot of that, for those generations, individuals just grew up in such ways that were foreign to them, and trying through this assimilation of just indigenous people, of taking that away and really intentionally, people really intentionally trying to systematically remove our way of life and our languages. And so as people come back, and there's a lot of, trauma that has been passed down through generations, because if you think about it, like now I don't know how to speak Tlingit. I am trying to learn, and there's many people that are, bringing our languages back to life. They weren't lost, but they were definitely, it's taken a little bit of while and a work to get that, to bring them
Back.
back to where it was. And maybe we'll never be back to where it was, as we're losing a lot of our elders who do know those languages. But we're definitely putting a lot of emphasis on learning our native languages and being able to do that. But those are things that are really tough. People
Yeah.
that came back that maybe didn't have the experience growing up hunting and fishing. So some people as adults are learning that. And so there's a number of things I think that we really need to address when it comes to that, to the trauma and to the things that have happened, because there are generations. I have listened to their stories about when they, went away to boarding schools and what is like coming back, and then being a parent, to kids and having to tell them what that was like.
Like, yeah. And even imagining, could you imagine your kids at that age? It reminds me of like two things. A couple months ago, I was talking to somebody who is from the Blackfeet Confederacy, and she was saying that her kids are relearning their language. She never learned their language, but her father, uh, or was it her grandfather? It may have been her grandfather, knew the language, got sent off to boarding school, and no, it was her father. And even though the kids were learning the language, and he was so proud of them, he was afraid to even speak it because of the way he was treated in boarding school. And it kind of reminds me of my grandparents. I'm Black. They grew up in South Carolina, and they weren't, weren't allowed to essentially vote, even when things like poll taxes didn't work, or yeah, they would put out jars of jelly beans, and you'd have to guess the number if you're black to be able to vote. But even when that didn't work, terror was used. And I remember my grandmother saying, she passed away a little more than a decade ago, that she was even reluctant to vote to the day she died. And I think people don't think about how these scars that happen 50, 60, 70 years before a person is born still reverberate. And I just kept on thinking of that as you were talking.
Yeah. Yeah, that's very true. And, we kind of had similar, circumstances here where, when you first get voting passed, it's like, okay, well, 5 white people need to sign off that you're civilized and that you can vote. I
Wow.
mean, some of the rules that they would put in, and it took a while to then, get our for Indigenous people to have their voting rights. So, we have all these instances of these different communities that have really been, suppressed. And so it takes a little while to get over that. And yeah, so it's tough. And
Yeah, it's not one of those things where you can snap your fingers and say, "Today it's all fair. Go, go, go forth without the scars that have been passed on."
right.
And the, like you said, the intergenerational trauma that exists that still um, affects communities today. And sort of thinking in that same vein of what affects communities today, what are the challenges that Alaskan natives you think are facing, their top challenges? And are they similar to the challenges that other indigenous people in the United States or in North America are facing?
I've heard a lot about, the crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous people that it really has been worldwide. I've seen reports coming out of Canada, and other places, definitely in lower 48 states as well. So I definitely think that, circumstances like that are happening. And we've definitely talked with, different organizations and tribes on, what the efforts that they're doing to bring advocacy and awareness. So that, that's kind of one topic you talk a lot about. We mentioned voting. I've done a lot of work around voting, and we have similar issues of having access to voting. That's been a problem across Alaska and the lower 48 and other places as well. So just really sharing those circumstances. But there are some unique challenges I think that Alaska has too with, how large we are as a state. We're very diverse, and, getting to different places. I mentioned that we took the ferry to get around in Southeast Alaska. When you can think about, being up north, a lot of times, the waterways, the rivers, being able to use the boats to get back and forth from communities, or snow machines or dog sleds or whatever way that they need to get across during the winter and summer months. So a lot of our villages are not accessible unless you're by boat or by plane, and then weather difficulties. So that makes a lot of complications when it comes to things like public safety, for example,
Mhm.
or getting, thinking about getting food into those communities, how expensive it is as well. So there's different kind of economical challenges as well when you're looking at, okay, I got to pay for these really high energy costs. In addition to this gallon of milk cost me $10 or more.
Mhm.
So there's a lots of different things. And so really understanding too that we need to rely on our traditional ways of life and hunting and fishing. And we do have a lot of impacts that come down from federal and state laws and regulations, try to regulate how we can fish and hunt. And so that also becomes, can be problematic at times, when we have different ceremonies that we do, which might not be during the regular hunting time. So we have to go make sure we ask permission and go through the right rules and laws and filling out forms to ensure that we can do that. And then during COVID, for example, I know there were communities that weren't getting, the food in, and seeing lots of pictures of empty shelves. So they had some communities applied for like a special hunt permit, got it from the federal government, and then were able to go out and hunt, kind of what's considered the off season for hunting, and then got sued by the state. So it's like, even
Mm.
when we go through some of the right ways to be able to do things, you know, we run into complications that way. So There are some different hurdles when it comes to multiple different avenues of even living our ways of life.
Well, I was thinking of one thing. I had just learned this year, and this definitely a lower 48 thing for sure. I wonder how it plays out in Alaska. But I was talking to one of my friends who's Indigenous, and she was going out, harvesting rice and then fishing for her family with her dad and her son for like, it was going to be a half year of fish that they were going to get. And she was telling me a lot about the right and authority to manage, fishing and wildlife on tribal land, particularly on the reservations where she was, or the land that used to be a part of the reservations. But I know the reservation system is slightly different in Alaska. What connotes tribal land for these kinds of things for you all in Alaska?
Yeah, we definitely have a different setup than the lower 48. And so we might have to do another podcast on that one. Because instead of setting up reservations, we do have one down in Metlakatla, but we only have one small reservation in Alaska. The rest, we went through the Alaskan Native Claims Settlement Act, where they set up Native corporations. So we
Mm.
have our Native corporations for different regions of the state. And then we have 229 federally recognized tribes, and we have village corporations. So we have kind of multi layers.
So 229, that's almost half of the tribes in the United States. Is that right?
hmm Yeah,
Wow.
we have more than like half of the yeah. So we have a lot of,
Wow.
and we have lots of. I'm a tribal citizen of the Tlingit and Haida Central Council down in Southeast Alaska, where that's a regional tribe. And so we have, larger tribes, so very small tribes. So yeah, there's a lot of different cultures, a lot of different tribes and people all across the state. And I think sometimes, when you look at maps, oftentimes of like the lower 48, they have Alaska down in like the corner of this little tiny thing. But,
Mhm,
but
mhm.
really,
Actually, like,
Alaska is
much
like,
bigger.
as you put Alaska over the US, I mean, we're 2.5 times the size of Texas. And so we pretty
Right.
much fill up like you superimpose Alaska over the rest of the US, we take up a big chunk of it. So just thinking about the different ways that we live in the different regions everywhere from I grew up in a rainforest. A lot of rain, wear lots of extra tough boots. But if you're up north, you're out in the tundra, which is a totally different atmosphere. So it's a lot of different a lot of different things going on in one state.
Well, and I think for a lot of us, yeah, I think a lot of us in the United States take for granted, and I'm sure this exists in Anchorage and other spots like that. Like, if I were to call 911 right now, there would probably 5 to 7 minutes, the cops would be here, and soon after, the EMTs would be right behind them. And if it took them 15 minutes, everyone would be outraged. Um, but I think about a place as vast and as rural as Alaska, whether you're native or not native, but particularly for the native communities, like help is not necessarily right around the corner from the state or from local governments. Does that change what people in their communities have to do to sort of take care of themselves as communities?
Yeah, most definitely. We don't have a 911 system really in Alaska. If you're out in rural Alaska, you're not going to you don't call 911. Like we don't have that system that's really set up like you would think about. We have it in our urban centers. I've been pushing for a number of years to update our 911 system to get one that works because a lot of times if someone dials 911, they get routed to a whole nother community, which is miles and miles away.
Oh, wow.
And so, yeah, we have, we have our state troopers. We have a village public safety officer program. And then, some communities might have tribal police, but really vast majority of our villages do not have any kind of public safety. And if something does happen in that community, then, you might be calling the troopers where they could be hours to days in order to get out there.
Oh, wow. Days.
So it's weather dependent. I know of communities where I've talked with tribal leaders where the tribal leader really had to be the person to step in. I unfortunately, have heard of numerous stories. One of our tribal leaders, shared the story even on the record in the legislature when we were pushing for Senate Bill 151 about there was a murder of a young girl and there was no one there. They had to call troopers to come in, and it was on the community to be protecting the scene. So when people come in, they could process the scene. But it took
Oh,
them
wow.
multiple hours to get there. I think he said like 16 hours or more, to be able to get there. So it was on the community to be there and watching over that. But in addition, think about all of the stress on this really small community of knowing that one of their community members was murdered, someone in their community had committed that crime, and just the amount of angst and
And
anger
help
and
wasn't going to.
sadness.
Oh,
Yes.
yeah. And help isn't going to be here soon. And we're mourning and we're upset. And all those things are happening at the same.
Your cardiologist knows your heart, and your mom knows how to mend your heart. Your ophthalmologist helps you see, and your best friend makes you feel seen. A visit to your physical therapist can heal your shoulder, and a visit to your grandma can heal your soul. Your health is a journey you don't take alone. Just like the people around you, all of us at Kaiser Permanente work together to help care for all that is you. Learn more at kp.org. Kaiser Permanente, for all that is you.
Bada, bada boom, sold.
Huh?
Just sold my car on Carvana. Dropping it off and getting paid today.
Already?
What, you still haven't sold yours? You told me about it months ago. Is the offer good?
Oh, the offer's great.
Don't have another car yet?
I could trade it in for this car I love.
Come on, what are we waiting for?
Ah, you're right.
Let's go.
Whether you're looking to sell your car right now or just whenever feels right, go to Carvana.com and sell your car the convenient way. Terms and conditions apply.
Same time. So I imagine like the relationship between the public safety agencies and particularly for the more remote communities, I imagine it has to be, or it needs to be strong for it to be effective. There need to be good relationships. And I know you've done some work around, you and many of your partners have done some work around that. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, it's actually a perfect day. I was participating in some of the cultural training review that's happening at the Department of Public Safety, but I'll back up a little bit. First is in 2018, myself and another individual, Charlene Upbuck, we got together and we met and we started talking about the work that we were doing, and specifically around public safety, lack of data, and missing and murdered Indigenous women. And so we had a conversation, and we just realized a lot of our work was culminating together. And so we decided, well, we need to do this. We need to start working together. So we started creating what's called the MMIWG2S Alaska Working Group. And so, which now consists of 5 Alaska Native nonprofit organizations. And we get together every single week, and we work together on anything from policy to data to advocacy, education. We have families that have had, gone through, their family members have been missing or been murdered that contact us. We work with law enforcement, and we just really try to figure out how we can make change here in Alaska. And so some of our recent efforts that we've done the last couple of years of making a really big stride in changing is we advocated to get missing and murdered Indigenous persons positions at the Department of Public Safety. So now we have 4 MMIP investigators. So we work directly with the commissioner and with the legislature to get funding for those 4 positions. And we also have now an MMIP statewide attorney general, assistant attorney general, to help in that area.
And MMIP, missing and murdered Indigenous people, and MMIWG2S, what did that stand for? I imagine missing, murdered Indigenous women, girls, and something I can't figure out.
Two-Spirit. So missing and
Oh,
murdered Indigenous women and girls, and Two-Spirit.
What does the two-spirit part mean?
So we really encompassed, so I'm going to go back and say there's kind of multiple different acronyms, right, that we've used throughout this time. It really started as MMIW, Missing More Indigenous Women, Missing More Indigenous Women and Girls. And really, I think the focus became on that because we had such high rates of women and girls that were going missing. Then it kind of switched to MMIP to ensure that we're including some of the men, that have been missing and some that have been murdered as well. But also with MMIWG2S, with Two Spirit, as we're really encompassing, all of our people.
The community, the
The
relatives.
community, relatives. We've used MMIR, Missing More Indigenous Relatives. So all of these
Mhm.
different, acronyms are really, I don't want to say one and the same, but pretty, kind of one and the same almost as we're
Same
working on
spirit.
that. Yeah, as,
Yeah.
how we're encompassing that. And when I think it really started with emphasizing, the women and girls because that's a lot of the people that we've seen that in general through our data is that it's been the women and girls that have been getting higher rates of domestic violence, sexual assault, that have been murdered. But we also understand that they're with MMIP that men are part of this as well.
Yeah. I Do you ever long for the day where we don't have to put the word indigenous in there and that we just sort of we as a country or people around the world just care equally about all people who are missing, all people who are murdered?
Yeah, I definitely hope that we get to a point where I don't have to do this work anymore, and that we can all learn to just be respectful and treat each other all with respect and love. Because it's really tough for anybody, to go through these things. But I think what's happening is, we've seen in the media, we've seen in the data where Indigenous people have gone missing in that regard. There, those cases are not being, blown up to the national level. You're not hearing about it. We've known, for many years that this has been an issue. And it just hasn't been talked about. It hasn't been talked about in the media. And it really wasn't until we had some data and numbers to show, hey, Indigenous people actually are going missing and being murdered at a higher rate. And so we had to really start collecting that data. And if you saw from the Urban Indian Health Institute, they put out a report, which I think really helped jumpstart. And folks out of Canada were doing some reports as well. And it's really helped put this issue on the map of saying this is needs to be addressed and needs to be addressed now. And
Yeah.
then, yeah.
And it's interesting, to your point about bringing data to the table and it not being a new problem, maybe for different reasons, but I imagine it's really truly been a problem that's been going on since colonization, maybe for different reasons now. But it's interesting that you had to, and I think it goes back to the public policy thing too, and it's a very American thing of show me your data right now, to prove that the sky is blue. One of the things that you had mentioned just a second ago, you had said that you were able to get those positions for people who are going to focus on missing and murdered Indigenous people, and you also mentioned an attorney general. I assume a prosecutor in that role who's going to be focused on that, or is it? I wanted to ask why you think that's important to have those dedicated resources to this kind of long running problem and how that might help.
Yeah, so we had just again, when it comes to policy, and I spent a lot of years in policy, they do ask for the data and the numbers. They want to see, it's an issue. And so we did have to go back, collect data and try to present, information to them. But I'll share this. So we were talking with the commissioner, and he said this to us and on the record. I didn't know that this was such a huge issue until they hired their first MMIP investigator. They hired one person. She was overwhelmed, and within a few months, she left the position. So we said, okay, well, we need to hire two people. They hired two, and he's like, oh my gosh, this isn't enough. We need to hire four. And he's gone to say that we could probably have as many as six. So
Wow.
if that to help paint the picture of understanding that there are a number of cold cases that just have not been worked on. There's a number of cases that are coming in that need attention, need to get worked on. So we have such high rates that we do need to have these really specific investigators to be addressing the cold cases to bring closure to families, and also to be addressing the new cases that are unfortunately coming up at this point. But we've really we've had to demonstrate that need, and when the commissioner saw it through these positions and hearing from families and hearing from communities, he got fully on board and was like, "Yep, we need to make this happen." And so that's how we also ended up. We had an MMIP statewide council for a little while that's kind of moved into a working group now. But there needed to be some really specific actions on how we address public safety and how we're addressing these cases throughout Alaska. And we've heard from families too, where they need to have, much more open communications. And so one of the pieces of the bill that we passed this year also included mandatory cultural training for law enforcement. And so that's a meeting I was in today, is they're getting ready to launch a new cultural training for all law enforcement as well.
By the way, I thought that was the coolest thing, because when I was reading the bill, I'm like, okay, I've seen, a hundred of these bills where the state prescribes what you need to do to be a police officer. And, it said basic police officer training. That makes sense. And then it was like minimum education requirements, or I forget what the other piece of it was. And then the third thing was this training that all police officers had to take, this cultural training about Indigenous, missing and murdered Indigenous people, done by a coordinator who was experienced in that. And I was like, wow, I don't think I've ever seen a state where you look at the requirements for police officers and you have 3 or however many, even if you have 20. And in those 3 requirements, one of them relates to missing and murdered Indigenous people and Indigenous cultural awareness. Was that a hard thing to get in there?
It's something that we've worked on for the last few years. Really, the bill that got passed this year is part of a number of different ideas, and really ideas that came from our communities and came from families when we were identifying some of the difficulties, and communication with law enforcement was a big one. And that's really how we got to some of the cultural trainings. And it was also myself and a few other my partners and kind of sisters in this work. We were serving on a municipal commission, and we saw some of their cultural trainings and kind of made us get more a larger voice in this work as well, because we saw some of the trainings that they were doing, and they really were inappropriate, and I think caused more harm. So after those videos and after hearing from our communities, we really, really pushed for the cultural trainings. And I think it's going to be really beneficial to enhance communications between law enforcement and communities, and having a real understanding of what Alaska is like, because we get a lot of people from the lower 48 that have never been here. And then you're going out to rural Alaska. That's really tough. We have, lots of different cultures, lots of different tribes, often different ways of life. And so by giving this basic training to understand who we are as Alaskans, as Alaska Native people, I think that's really going to enhance relationships. And by building those relationships, you're going to have much better communication. So people are going to hopefully then be able to talk with law enforcement more openly, or, if they're out in the community and something happens, that people will want to talk to them, because we really want to see those relationships build, and they need to understand what it's like, and just not go into our communities and kind of, push their beliefs on other folks, or not know how to communicate. So attending the just kind of the overview of what we're working on building this training up, I think it's going to be really beneficial for everybody, for the communities and for the troopers, for success.
Because we know, I think, anywhere, probably around the world, that for any community where, the police come in and sort of like don't respect, let's say, your traditions or your perspective, or, the really hostile relationships or fear is somehow in there, that people don't pick up the phone to call, they don't cooperate, and all it does is sort of like harm the community in a different way. It becomes a kind of no-win situation. But I was thinking about what you were saying about the training, and I was thinking about all the different cultures that you mentioned, and I imagine like a part of it isn't isn't so much picking up knowledge about the different cultures, but knowing how to ask the right questions from people when you get there, to educate yourself about the culture before you start stomping around with your boots, your rules, and all those other things. Because I'm just thinking about myself. This weekend, I'm actually going to a powwow in Minnesota, and I have 100 questions before I get there, because they're probably things that I couldn't even possibly, I think of, or even think to ask. And I wonder, for your law enforcement officers, it's really about sort of like slowing down and asking the right questions when they're in communities. Is that a part of it, that critical thinking and that critical pause to make sure you're being respectful of the culture and supportive and things like that?
Yeah, yeah, and it's giving a little bit of history about maybe some things on why we are the way we are, I guess. It's giving a
Right.
little bit of history about the colonization. It's giving a
Mhm.
little history about maybe where some trauma's coming in. But it's also talking about like our way of life, around hunting and fishing, to understand what it's even like in Alaska. And not just like Native people are out hunting and fishing. I mean, all Alaskans are. So when you go into a community, why are we so busy in doing these things? Like, understand it's fishing season or it's hunting season. So I think,
Mm.
or if you're going into a community, also knowing those protocols that are, important to do. Cause like, if you're going into a village of maybe just a couple hundred people and like a new person shows up, they're like, oh my God, who are you? What are you doing here? Like, what's that proper protocol is, calling the tribal leader ahead of time, knowing those things that you may not know, understandably, if you're from lower 48 coming up and into Alaska for the first time, so those things I think are important to know too. So you really get off on the right foot. But one other thing I do want to say when it comes to cultural training is, while it might be focused on Indigenous, we also understand and recognize, we have a very diverse communities throughout Alaska. We have some of the most diverse high schools in the nation, with over 100 languages spoken here, out where
Oh,
I live in
wow.
East Anchorage. And so when we talk about, Indigenous, we've also, talk about, well, we have, a number of different cultures and diversity. So also mentioning and recognizing that, that there are many communities, not that, it's a lot to take in, but we have just understanding that and knowing when you come into Alaska, it's, a very diverse place.
Yeah, because I think about places like where you grew up. It certainly has a long-running Native influence. Obviously, there's an American influence, but there's also British cultural influence, Russian cultural influence. Alaska is a much more diverse place than I think we tend to think, both in terms of its history, institutions, and other things like that. I was thinking about the cultural training, and I was wondering, and I was thinking about that point about having good relationships. I imagine it's sort of like a two-way street too, because for your tribal leaders, they probably need to understand the way that law enforcement operates or how to interact with them. Is it kind of a two-way street in terms of what you guys are trying to accomplish? Not necessarily just purely through the legislation, but I mean more broadly, to develop those relationships, those bonds, those positive relationships.
For sure. I've always said, two-way street. So when I'm talking with, whether it be commissioners or tribal leaders, it's how can we help you, but also like it's reciprocal. And so sometimes that, I'll have people at Department of Public Safety reach out to me with questions, and I reach out to them with questions. And I think just fostering those relationships and understanding what we need is important. And, understanding what our communities need as well, because that's one thing I've talked a lot about in different circles is each community needs different things. Maybe they want a village public safety officer, but maybe they don't. Maybe they want a tribal police officer, or maybe they want, maybe their priority is a community health aide because they don't have one. So, where can we meet the communities on where they are as well? So it's not a one size fits all. And I think that that's where really building communications through, tribes, state, federal, all the different agencies is really important. So we're not pushing things on communities that they don't want. And I think for communities also, saying what they want, but also how can the state help them in certain ways. So definitely a two-way street. And I think that always said communication is key. And that's what we really want to build. And so just really opening up, different ways of viewing things, different ways of working together. So we have lots of layers of governments. We have our tribal sovereign governments because they're all, we are 229 tribes. We have, our municipal governments, and we have our state government. There's all these different layers, and they really need to learn to work together.
Right. But one of the things that I was kind of interested in, and I watched some of the hearings around the Senate bill, and watched video of the commissioner speaking and other people speaking. And one of the things that surprised me, and I imagine, and this is just my guess, so correct me if I'm wrong, Alaska probably has a higher percentage of native residents than the lower 48. But one of the things that really surprised me was how on board so many of the state officials, like the commissioner, the legislators who were talking. And I imagine it hasn't always been like that. Those relationships have not been like that. How have you guys been able to develop those relationships and that focus? I know you gave the example of just education helped with the commissioner and going hands on through the experience of trying to do something about these cases. But that's one thing I imagine for a lot of Indigenous communities in the lower 48 that would be helpful to understand how you develop the relationships piece of it.
Yeah, it definitely took us a while to get to this point. So there was a lot of education, behind the scenes work, and also understanding this was not our first year of introducing this bill. We've introduced it multiple other times when we couldn't even get a hearing. so,
Right.
I've stressed communication and relationships, and it's really taken people that want to sit down and talk with us. So we've been putting out a lot of education, awareness, and advocacy. So that's one piece of it, right? So multiple of our organizations, like I said, we have the working group, we have other partners that we work with. And so really, we've done big education pushes. We have had, one-on-one meetings with legislators, talking about it and really having to do a lot of educating ahead of time, before like bills come out, before we even introduce them. So we've done a lot of like one-on-one meetings. And it's been really helpful because of the fact that I worked in the legislature. And so I have a lot of those relationships. And so there were times maybe when I've called some offices and maybe they, when we didn't have as supportive people that didn't really want to address it or didn't want to talk about it. But we just continue calling and we just continue pushing out information and providing those information and questions. We host lunch and learns. We go to all different places. I sat on lots of different boards and commissions, and we talk about this. Community councils. So it's lots of different spaces where we bring this up, and so just building relationships and talking with people has been huge.
Yeah, and I think if you don't have experience in in legislative environments, I think it's really easy to sort of think that the first no that you get means no, and the person is not interested. But I have a friend in DC who likes to say, when you're lobbying, no means just come back tomorrow.
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
You can't give up, and you have to. And sometimes, we definitely face some really, really uneducated comments, some really kind of just not great experiences either. And it's still having to push through that and understand, okay, they really don't know about our cultures. Maybe they don't know at all about rural Alaska. So we just need to educate them some more and keep talking and keep showing up. And that's what we do. We kept showing up. And I was really thankful. I got introduced to, she's now the commissioner, Commissioner Kim Koval. We had built a relationship with her, and then we were able to build a relationship with Commissioner Cockrell, who's there, who's now, been really supportive of the different changes. And so it's taken, and we've talked with people before them who maybe were not as supportive or interested, or maybe other things to do. So it's just continuing to talk to people, continuing to build those relationships to help move things forward, but also we're not just doing it on the state level.
Calling all Patriots. Election day is here. We need you to do your part and make our victory too big to rig. Make your plan to vote right now. Go online to www.swampthevote.org. Thousands of Democrat votes are being cast right now. Don't let them win. Republicans are counting on you to join the red wave. Confirm your polling place at www.swampthevote.org. That's swampthevote.org. Together we will secure our border, stop the Democrats' crime epidemic, and make America great again. Confirm your polling place right now at www.swampthevote.org. Paid for by the Republican National Committee. Not authorized by any candidate or candidates committee. The Republican National Committee is responsible for the content of this advertising. GOP.com.
O'Reilly. You've got questions? O'Reilly Auto Parts has answers. Need a pro you can trust? We've got that too. No matter what you need, our professional parts people have the training and expertise to help you do things right. Deep automotive knowledge. Just one part that makes O'Reilly stand apart. The professional parts people.
O'Reilly Auto Parts.
So that's just like one piece of our work, right? We have to think about how are we addressing it and taking care of communities. So at the Alaskan Native Women's Resource Center, we built a toolkit that we can provide to communities to understand, okay, and the toolkit is prepping, really prepping your communities for times when someone might be going missing. What is it that you need to do? What are the steps that you need to take to ensure that you're writing down exactly what that person was wearing, making sure that you report that person missing, because some people believe you need to wait 24 hours. And we have a big campaign saying, no, do not wait 24 hours. Report people right away if they've gone missing. So there's lots of other pieces that we do to work with communities, to work with tribes, and then talking with them, like I mentioned earlier, what do you need in your community? Is it public safety? Is it health aides? Who is it that we can help support for you? And so it's just a lot of that work. And it takes, while our organization does this work, there's lots of organizations that do this, as well. And so it's being able to communicate and talk to each other about that too.
Yeah, and that was one of the things that you mentioned in there was the collecting the information and knowing when to report people and all those myths that are around that. And that toolkit sounds like a great idea. But one of the things I was super impressed by, if you try to find data on, specific Indigenous missing people who are Indigenous across the United States, you get a wide variety of, all sorts of different data depending on what state you're in, or whether the Bureau of Indian Affairs is involved, or whether the FBI is involved, or wherever it was. But one of the things you had mentioned, Charlene, before, that, the data that they've collected is a lot better than even some of the data that the FBI collects on the cases that it's involved in, or excuse me, it's the Justice Department NamUs database. And it's just neat to see people to, someone on a local level, on a state level, to build something like that could hopefully be a model for other, if not others, well, I guess states that are investing into addressing the problems, or tribal police departments that are trying to address. I wonder whether that toolkit, I guess what I'm saying is, whether it has export potential to our side of Canada over here.
Yeah, well, I think we all learn from each other for sure.
Yeah.
And when I look at policies and what could we do in Alaska to help improve things, I definitely look across other states and countries to say, what are they doing? And so I hope some of the things maybe we do in Alaska might be beneficial for another place. I mean, you always have to, as I say, I kind of Alaskanize things. And so you have to make it work for your state. But in 2018, when we started putting, this working group together, one of the things we wanted to do at a rally was read names of those that have gone missing or being murdered as just remembrance and uplifting them and remembering them, because they're people, they're not just data points. And there was no list. And we were like, wait, what? Where's all this data? And so literally, Charlene started collecting all of these names, and communities and families were coming forward and giving these names, because we really recognize that information is not being collected really. And we need to hone our own database. And it's much in the data for Indigenous justice that, Charlene and others, it's her board started, and she's really been pushing forward in this, is having this database that is comprehensive and taking into account all of the information that we have from families. And now her first report came out, at 229 names. And I know she's me working on another report where she's collected over 1,000, so as time goes on, and she's honed that database. It's not something that that she shares out, because it's hers, but she'll definitely, work with folks. But I think people are really willing to share that information because she built these relationships with people. And she's also really understanding how other law enforcement are collecting data and how it's put in their system, because the systems also don't talk to each other. So they're going to have different data, like the FBI or somewhere else, because of all these different data systems. So if they collect their data, and let's say that, if they put in, one of the things was they were putting in how they're missing, whether it's environmental or suspicious, they were all just missing. So you didn't know if it was environmental until you had to really dig into the data. So she really pushed to say, well, can you make it is it environmental, or is it suspicious, or what is it? So it's really having to break that down and having those conversations. So I really appreciate her conversations of getting into those data points. And then also to the point too of making sure that Alaskan Natives are being represented, and not just, sometimes you might look at an individual and not ask if they're Native or not, and just mark them down as white. So some people are just marked down with no, that being recognized that they're Alaskan Native. Because, my friends call me the White Raven. I am Tlingit Raven Kiksawty, so I'm Tlingit Raven Frog. And so from my background, that's who I am. And you look at me, and you're not going to look at me and go, oh, you're Native, of course. But I've really been dubbed as the White Raven. And so if someone's going to look at me, they might not mark me down as a Tlingit, even though on all my records, I obviously am. But you have to ask those questions, and that's the other part of training, like law enforcement. And I brought that up in the cultural training meeting just today, saying, look, you can't just look at someone and because your data points have been wrong, and we know this to be true. You need to talk with community members. I'm Tlingit, I'm German, I'm Irish, so there you go. Mark me down for all of that, but you can't discount
all of the above.
that.
Right.
But sometimes they'll just mark, oh, you might be multiracial. Well, that doesn't account for anything then. We're missing in the data if you don't mark it down correctly. And as we know, the data points become important, because when we want to make policy changes, they ask for the data. And if we don't have it, they're like, oh, maybe it's not an issue, maybe it is, but come back to us when you have the data. So we know that those things are important.
It's sort of getting on the ground in the beginning and make sure. I was going to ask you a quick question about the cultural training. Is that something, it'll obviously apply to all new police officers. Are you guys going to go backwards and have previously certified police officers go through something as well?
Yep. They get it in the beginning, and it's going to be part of training that's going to happen every year. So it won't be even like a one and done type of thing. It's going to be ongoing training. So it'll be in the first, when you're bringing folks on board, and then it will be in additional trainings kind of throughout the time. So.
And that builds in accountability, which is nice when you're coming back again and you're going to have to report on how it went.
Yeah.
One of the things that I was kind of thinking about as you were talking about some of these challenges, like around public safety and other things like that, are there underlying challenges that you see that need to be addressed or will be in the next phase of things that need to be addressed?
Yeah, most definitely. I think that's really what, we kind of put our wish list of things together. And so the bill that passed this year for our state policy is things that we knew we could get passed. But that doesn't mean that we are done by any means. There's a lot of work to be done, and some of this in the realms of public safety funds, for example, ensuring that we have public safety in all the communities that need it. So we continue to push for that. Pushing for other things like tribal police and enhancing our tribal courts, and I think that's also really important to understand that our communities and our tribes are sovereign, have their own tribal court systems, and making sure that those are supported, because there are so many great things about tribal courts, that it's a much more restorative justice system. So, for example, if a law may be broken, you sit down with your elders and with the people in the community, and you can talk to people and having like healing wellness and talking circles, and you think of more restorative kind of justice things. So we're not just gonna, lock
How
you
do
up
we how
in
do we bring
jail.
you back in? How do we bring you back in? Right.
Exactly. And so I think those are things that are really important that all interplay with each other, right? So all of these different things are really important to come back to. There are definitely some specific, public safety things that we're looking at, MMIP things. But also when talking about a lot of the work that I do at the Resource Center is also related to domestic violence and sexual assault. So we have some funding that's been decreasing over the years to support our shelters and prevention efforts. So we're looking at more ways that we can put in prevention efforts, and bringing those specific ideas from communities to our state leaders, and saying, okay, we need these projects.
Yeah, I was curious about the things like prevention efforts, because I imagine, like, if you're facing domestic abuse, even in a highly populated, you could be an apartment building with 100 neighbors that you all get along with. It's often very secret and people may not know. But I imagine in a rural community, rural tribal community, where you're very isolated and there may not be a women's shelter in the town over or something else like that. Like, what does prevention look like?
Yeah, definitely a good question. And so some of the things that we've been looking at is like safe housing options. And so some of those things of changing around how do you fund and ensure that there are safe housing options. And sometimes there's different law and policies that kind of don't work for rural Alaska, but I think really working with the communities to ensure there is safe housing. It may not be a specific shelter, but maybe there's a house in the community that maybe it's being able to get someone out of town.
Yeah, right.
So
To
how do
be
you
able,
do that?
Mhm.
Whether it's the victim or survivor of domestic violence, or maybe you need to remove. Honestly, in my opinion, I think you should be removing the person that's causing the harm out of
The
the
abuser,
community.
right?
Yeah,
Yes,
and
right,
so
right.
how do you do that? But also understanding that we talked about this before, there's underlying trauma that's happening with our communities. So even for the abusers, what's happening or happened to them that's creating this issue? So how can you address that? And one of the ways we've really talked about is culture being our best protective factor. We're actually getting ready to do our prevention and wellness summit for the Resource Center just this next week. And we're really focusing on how, culture is that best protective factor, is knowing you're hunting, fishing, gathering, making yourselves, making all these different things, but being involved in the community, being brought into the community in that way. Because remember, as we talked about colonization. We talked about things like maybe that person didn't learn to hunt or fish. And there's certain things that I really think if you can address trauma that's been happening and bring people into the communities in a different type of way, that's going to hopefully heal some of the trauma and maybe some of the things that they're portraying on
Hmm.
other people. So I
So,
think
like
that's
the
just,
idea, if people don't feel as alone and isolated and they feel a sense of belonging, that would decrease the likelihood, right, of shattering. Right, right, right.
Yeah,
Did
there were
yeah.
some different projects around culture as a protective factor, and especially when I was doing some work on suicide prevention, is geared toward our youth and putting in a lot of culture aspects for our youth in particular. And we were funding this project because we had high rates of suicide in some of our villages, and it started going well, but then the funding went away. Because a lot of the funding that's starting to come down is kicks in after someone's been victimized. And so we're trying to turn that around to say you need to put in some like prevention efforts ahead of time because that's the
Mm.
hardest part to get funding for. So it's a lot of those conversations too. And what does prevention look like, right? Because it can look like a lot of different ways. And I talked about the Restorative Justice Center, the restorative justice kind of approach to it, because if we can catch, youth maybe that are going down a bad path, we can kind of fix that before it goes
Hmm.
down. I
And
think.
find good paths that can help the community and find, yeah, that makes sense. I have a path. You need to send some of them to go work in the legislature and get that experience early. So we have the next Kendra prepared. Which actually brings me to a point. Like, I am an absolute optimist, but I don't think. I mean, I'm naive, but I don't think I'm this naive to think that this is a problem that will be solved in your lifetime or my lifetime. So I was going to ask you what you kind of hope for the future, hope for your children, hope for our lifetimes when it comes to Indigenous people, whether they're in Alaska or other places.
Gosh, well, I really hope that they solve this in my lifetime and everyone learns to be kind and respectful and not hurt other people. But you're probably right. It might take a little longer, unfortunately, to build in that. But um, I think a lot of the things that I think on and I brought up before is everyone has a place in this work or whatever work that you're doing. You're a musician, you're an artist, you're a policy nerd like me, you're a data person. There's a space for everyone to go in and make a difference. Art speaks to people in much different ways, in such powerful ways. So does music. And there's also the need for those policy changes, but we all have to do that together. But without that really cohesive action, and getting feds, state, and everyone to work together to start making, these types of changes, I I fear that, these types of issues will not be resolved. But I'm also very optimistic and thinking like looking at what we've been able to change in the last few years, and people I feel like have, starting to open in their eyes, to the issue around missing more Indigenous people, but it opens up this whole conversation around public safety. And then it opens up this whole conversation around communication and cultural awareness. So, really my hope for the future is that this continued education and advocacy, it won't be so hard because we have, people that are in the know and they understand what's happening, and hopefully looking at more ways that we can do prevention and thinking like, oh, culture, that could be a really big part of it. And understanding like, yeah, that sounds great. Other than, some of the ideas we're met with now, like, oh, come on, fishing isn't going to fix anything. But it's really understanding the connections between all of the different things that are happening in our lives.
Yeah, because it's like the example that you gave about your daughter with the fish. Like, that's a part of what ties her to her family. It's part of what ties her to her community. And it's a part of what, allows all these other things, like you mentioned the tribal courts and the restorative justice. It allows all of them to work. And that sense of belonging also leaves people feeling less alone, less isolated, less likely to lash out. Like, I think there's like a piece to kind of what you're saying that just so resonates with me about the importance of having a sense of community, in a community that not just like on the I did this to you today, but the broader perspective can really help heal wounds that exist within the community. But I also think like another piece of it is for those of us who are not Native, is being able to see you all as a part of our community where we respect your traditions and respect your religion and respect your culture, but actually see you as us on as a part of our broader community. And I don't know how we solve for that. Like, how do we solve for that?
Yeah, and I think, of course, I talk a lot about Indigenous community because that's like, my work and what we do. But understand there's a lot of people out in rural Alaska that, may not be Indigenous, but they still really live the traditional way of hunting and fishing. And it's that living in harmony piece and, respecting each other and showing each other dignity. And even if you have different beliefs, that doesn't mean you need to push your beliefs on someone else, but it's learning that deep respect. And I think another piece of this too is not every community or person is going to be the same. I talked about this on how, one community might have different needs. And so really thinking about you don't need to push on like, oh, you need to have, I'm going to say use public safety. You need to have a trooper because that's what you need. And when the community is like, maybe not. Maybe we just actually want you to support our tribal court and we want to do it our way in the restorative justice way. So it's also respecting the cultures and the people and the communities on what they need and want. Because if you push something on them that they don't want or that's not going to work, it's not a one size fits all thing. So, and I think that can create some animosity too and pushing systems that don't work. So it's really respecting sovereignty as well. And that's what people really need to understand too. Tribes are sovereign. But this not just for tribes, but it's for communities as well. Even lower 48. I mean, the things that work here in Alaska, probably may not work there. So any of these ideas, you really look at it, and then what does it fit for your community? But, again, it comes down to that basic level of respect and communication that we all, I think, can have for each other. There's, like I said, there's over 100 languages spoken here in Alaska. And I think that is so beautiful. And I think that makes everything so much richer. And, just being able to experience those different cultures is really great. And I appreciate that about, living here in Alaska.
Yeah, I imagine those things like respect and love will go far. And if we can communicate on top of that, well, we're probably in a much better world and a much better place, not just for Indigenous people, but for all of us. I wanted to thank you and give you a chance if you had any closing thoughts or, a message you want to send. I felt like this conversation, it certainly, kind of highlights some of the challenges and some of the opportunities for Indigenous people. But I also, to the point that you were saying, it probably is instructive for anyone trying to build and maintain and get the value out of communities. But I just wanted to see if there's anything you wanted to share before we wrap.
I think we just solved the problem right there, right? If everybody can just be love and respectful of each other, I think we got it solved, right? But I know but I really, I appreciate this time. I'm glad that we had a chance to connect, and it's very interesting the way that, we get to meet each other through this, vast different places
Weird
that we
world,
live.
right? Yes, right. Yes.
But, finding those commonalities and learning about each other and what's going on in our communities, I think is really cool, and being able to share about it. So I appreciate being able to be on today and meeting you. And thanks for, highlighting this issue in Alaska, and hopefully people kind of resonate and shake their heads and
see what they can do to help too, right? Exactly. I feel the same way. I'm better for every one of these conversations that I have, because I've always felt like the more I know, the more that people are open with me about their culture and their needs and their communities, it just allows me to love them better. And I appreciate the opportunity to have this kind of conversation. So
yeah, thank you. And like I say, it's always a two-way street. So, people that want to reach out and want to learn more, always happy to have those conversations. So it's great. So, goodness cheesh, thank you. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, and thank you too. If you would like to join us for more discussions with me and other listeners, We can be found on most social media platforms, including a listener-run Facebook group called the Silver Linings Fireside Chat. For deeper conversations with our guests and live conversations with other listeners, you can also join us on our Patreon at www.patreon.com/The Silver Linings Handbook. This is Jason Blair, and this is the Silver Linings Handbook podcast. We'll see you all again next week.
Calling all Patriots. Election day is here. We need you to do your part and make our victory too big to rig. Make your plan to vote right now. Go online to www.swampthevote.org. Thousands of Democrat votes are being cast right now. Don't let them win. Republicans are counting on you to join the red wave. Confirm your polling place at www.swampthevote.org. That's swampthevote.org. Together we will secure our border, stop the Democrats' crime epidemic, and make America great again. Confirm your polling place right now at www.swampthevote.org. Paid for by the Republican National Committee. Not authorized by any candidate or candidates committee. The Republican National Committee is responsible for the content of this advertising. GOP.com.